I slapped my last two silver dollars on the auction block, and the sound they made was pathetic. A thin, lonely clink in the thick, dusty air of a Montana afternoon. It was everything I had left in this world. My name is Porter Jenkins, and I was a man on the edge of breaking. The crowd, a rough collection of ranchers and railmen, had been murmuring all day. But when my $2 hit the wood, they fell silent. For a second. Then a roar of laughter erupted, shaking the makeshift platform. The auctioneer, a greasy man with a stained vest, bellowed, "Sold! The mail-order bride no one else wanted goes to the fool with $2. More laughter, sharp and mean. But I wasn't looking at them. My eyes were fixed on the woman standing on that block. Her face was pointed at the floorboards, but her back was straight as a pine tree. There was a strange kind of dignity in the way she stood there. A stillness that made the cackling crowd sound like a bunch of fools. I didn't have a damn thing to offer her. My ranch was failing, my spirit was half gone, and my only companion was the ghost of my dead brother. But I knew with a certainty that chilled my bones, that a life with me had to be better than the fate waiting for her if I didn't step forward. Because I wasn't just looking at a woman, I was looking at my last and only hope. The year was 1873. The Montana Territory was a beautiful and unforgiving beast. The winter had been a killer, burying my fences in snow and taking nearly half my herd with it. At 32, I was old enough to know I couldn't survive another one alone. My brother Thomas had been the heart of the operation. Since he'd passed, the place was just hollow. The advertisement for mail-order brides had felt like a joke, a desperate man's last resort. I hadn't even come to town to bid. I needed flour and salt, that's all. But then I saw her, the last one they brought out, the one no one else bid a penny on. Something about her broke through the fog of my own grief. Her papers said her name was Penelope Foster. As I walked toward the platform, she kept her eyes down, clutching a small, worn valise to her chest like a shield. Her dress was plain brown, practical, and smudged with the grime of a long journey. "Miss Foster," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I tipped my hat. "I'm Porter Jenkins." She finally looked up, and I swear the world stopped for a second. Her eyes were the color of a mountain lake just after the ice melts, deep, clear, and colder than any winter I'd ever known. There was no fear in them, no gratitude, just assessment, like she was sizing up a piece of livestock. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice steady and educated, "I appreciate your intervention. The other offers were less than favorable." I glanced over my shoulder. The men who'd been laughing the loudest were lingering, rough-looking characters who ran the saloon and the brothel on the edge of town. My gut clenched. I hadn't just bought a helper. I'd snatched a rabbit from a pack of wolves. But the way she watched them, her eyes like chips of ice, I had the strangest feeling. Maybe she was the wolf. "Let's get your papers and be on our way," I said, keeping my voice low. "Trail gets bad after sundown." The marriage broker was a fat, sweating man who smelled of cheap tobacco. He shoved her contract at me. "She was supposed to fetch $50, he grumbled. "The boss will have my hide for this." "She fetched what the market would bear," I shot back. $2 was the only bid you got that wasn't looking to put her to work on her back." His face went red. "Now see here." "We're done," I said, turning my back on him. There was something off about the whole transaction. His anger felt less about the money and more about the fact that I was the one who'd won the bid. It felt personal. Outside, I loaded my meager supplies onto the wagon. Penelope stood beside it, silent and still. That valise was still clutched in her hands. "You can put that in the back," I said, gesturing with my thumb. She hesitated for a long moment, then placed it carefully among the sacks of flour and salt. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, her voice crisp, "I feel I should inform you, I am not experienced in the traditional duties of a wife." I stopped what I was doing and looked at her. "But I am a very hard worker," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I can cook, clean, and manage accounts. I also taught literature and mathematics at a school in Boston. Before." "Before what?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. A shadow passed over her face so quick I almost missed it. before circumstances required me to seek alternative arrangements. The words were precise, chosen, not the words of a desperate woman, but the words of someone hiding something massive. I ain't looking for a wife in the usual sense, Miss Foster, I said, deciding to be plain. My ranch is failing. My brother, he's gone. I need help. A partner. If you can cook and help with the books, that's more than enough. Relief washed over her face, but it was quickly masked. I understand. In that case, I believe this arrangement can be mutually beneficial. Mutually beneficial. It sounded like a business deal. As we rode out of town, the silence in the wagon was heavy. I pointed out landmarks, the tall pine, the rock that looked like a sleeping bear. She didn't seem to care about the scenery. Her eyes were scanning the trail behind us, constantly, like she was expecting to be followed. When we crested the last hill, my ranch came into view. A small cabin, a leaning stable, a broken-down barn. The few cattle I had left looked like lonely ghosts in the fading light. This is it, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Home. Penelope didn't say a word. She just stared, her expression unreadable. Then she asked a question that stunned me. How many head? 27, I answered, surprised. Lost half the herd this past winter. She nodded, her eyes sweeping across the valley. And the acreage? 160, I said, watching her now with a new kind of suspicion. Homesteaded it with my brother 5 years back. You know a thing or two about ranching, Miss Foster? My father had a farm in Pennsylvania, she said vaguely. I understand the principles. Something told me she understood a lot more than just principles. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. I'd made an effort. One main room, a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs. A single door led to the bedroom. You'll take the bedroom, I said, setting her valise down. I'll sleep out here. She looked at me, a flicker of surprise in those icy blue eyes. I can't displace you from your own bed, Mr. Jenkins. Porter, I corrected her. And it's no trouble. Been falling asleep by the fire most nights anyway. Then you must call me Penelope. She paused, her gaze sweeping the small space. Where is your well? Creek out back, about 50 yards. I'll prepare supper, she said, already moving toward my small pantry. Her movements were efficient, precise. She wasn't just making a meal. She was taking inventory of my entire life. As I watched her, I knew one thing for sure. This was no simple schoolteacher from Boston. Her posture, her speech, the way her eyes never stopped moving, the secrets she held behind that cold, beautiful gaze. She was a mystery wrapped in a plain brown dress. And for $2 silver, I hadn't just bought a bride. I'd bought myself a whole world of trouble. The first week passed in a strange, silent truce. Penelope moved through my life like a ghost, organizing, cleaning, mending. She rose before the sun, had breakfast ready when I woke, and packed my lunch before I headed out. The cabin had never been so clean. The books had never been so orderly. I'd return at dusk, bone-weary and covered in dust, to find a hot meal on the table and the cabin transformed. She'd put wildflowers in a tin can. She'd found an old quilt in her valise and draped it over a chair. Small touches that made the place feel less like a tomb for my brother and more like a home. But it was all business. We spoke of the weather, the price of feed, the work that needed doing. Never about her past. Never about my grief. We were 2 strangers sharing a roof, bound by a $2 contract. Then on the 8th day, everything changed. I was saddling my horse when she came out of the cabin. She was wearing a pair of my old trousers she'd tailored to fit her, and one of my brother's old work shirts. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, practical braid. I'm coming with you today, she said. It wasn't a request. I stopped, the bridle in my hand. Penelope, this ain't ladies' work. She raised a single eyebrow. The look she gave me could have frozen fire. Starving to death isn't ladies' work either, Porter. You said you needed a partner. I intend to be one. I studied her for a long second. The set of her jaw was pure granite. There was no arguing with it. Can you ride? And I asked. I can stay on a horse, she replied. I gave her Maple, my oldest, gentlest mare. By noon I was speechless. She rode as if she'd been born in a saddle. She had an eye for the land, spotting things I would have missed. She pointed to a small ravine. There's a heifer hiding in those bushes. She's favoring her left foreleg. I'd have ridden right past it. Sure enough, a young cow was tangled in some thorny brush, her leg twisted and bleeding. As we worked together to free the animal, I found myself watching her hands. They were strong, capable, and moved with a confidence that was unnerving. Later that afternoon, she was mending a stretch of fence while I replaced a rotten post. Her movements were quick and efficient, too efficient, and that's when I saw it. A flash of something dark on the inside of her right forearm, just below her rolled-up sleeve. A tattoo. It was a strange, intricate symbol, like a coiled snake or a knot of rope. Not the kind of thing you see on a Boston school marm. Before I could ask, she pulled her sleeve down. But it was too late. I'd seen it. That night, the silence at the dinner table was different. It was charged with my unspoken question. Who are you, Penelope Foster? After dinner, as we sat by the fire, I finally broke the silence. That fence you fixed today. You've done that before. She didn't look up from the sock she was darning. As I said, my father had a farm. My father had a farm too, I said, my voice low. And he never taught me to tie a wire knot like that. That's the kind of knot a sailor uses. Or a soldier. She stopped darning. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. She finally looked at me, and the coldness in her eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. My story about Boston, she began quietly, was not entirely true. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a man, the headmaster's son, she said, but he wasn't my suitor. He was my employer, and his business was not education. She took a deep breath. His name is Arthur Vance. His father owns a shipping empire, and they deal in more than just tea and textiles. They move weapons, opium, people. I was hired as a governess for his young daughter, but my real job was to keep his private ledgers. I have a mind for numbers, you see. My blood ran cold. I discovered the true nature of his business, she continued, her voice barely a whisper. The full extent of his cruelty. I couldn't be a part of it. I copied his most incriminating ledgers, the ones that could send him and his father to the gallows. I took them and I ran. The valise, that worn-out little bag she guarded so fiercely. He's been hunting me ever since, she said, from Boston to Chicago, and now here. The mail-order bride system, it was the most desperate thing I could think of, a way to disappear, to become someone else. Mrs. Porter Jenkins. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for me to understand. I never meant to bring this danger to your door, Porter. When I saw those men at the auction, the ones from the saloon, they weren't just local thugs. They were his. They were there for me. It all clicked into place. The auctioneer's anger, her constant watchfulness, the feeling that I had stumbled into something far bigger than a simple transaction. I had used my last $2 to buy a woman on the run from one of the most powerful and ruthless men in the country. My failing ranch was no longer my biggest problem. Just staying alive was. The next morning, the world looked different. Every shadow seemed longer. Every gust of wind sounded like a threat. We weren't just partners in ranching anymore. We were allies in a war I never signed up for. These ledgers, I said as we drank coffee in the pre-dawn gloom. Where are they? She looked at me for a long moment, then walked to the fireplace. She reached deep inside the chimney, behind a loose stone I had never noticed before, and pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped package. She laid it on the table between us. It was thin, but heavy with secrets. This is enough to destroy him, she said, but we have no one to give it to. Vance has lawmen and judges in his pocket all across the country. So we're on our own, I said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. A strange kind of calm settled over me. For months, I'd been fighting a losing battle against weather and debt. It was a slow, grinding defeat. This was different. This was a fight with a face. A fight I could win or lose on my own terms. We spent the day working, but with a new purpose. We weren't just mending fences. We were fortifying our home. We checked sight lines from the cabin, planned escape routes into the hills, and took inventory of our weapons. I had my rifle and a revolver. Penelope, it turned out, was a dead shot. She took my rifle, held it like she was born with it, and hit a tin can I'd set on a fence post 50 yards away. 3 times in a row. "The farm in Pennsylvania," I said, staring at her in disbelief. "Did your father also teach you to shoot like that?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "My father was a gentleman, a farmer and a preacher. He died when I was 16. After that, I learned to rely on myself." The more she revealed, the less I knew. Each layer she peeled back only exposed a deeper mystery. That afternoon, as we were checking the northern fence line, we found it. A new survey marker, half hidden in the brush. A small, freshly cut piece of wood driven into the ground. It was 100 yards inside my property line. "Someone's trying to steal your land," she said, her voice tight. "Not just trying," I said, my gut twisting into a cold knot. I followed the line of sight from the marker. It pointed directly toward a small, rocky outcropping on my land. An outcropping my brother Thomas had spent weeks exploring before he died. He called it his project. Suddenly, a terrible thought took root in my mind. Thomas's death hadn't been an accident. He hadn't just fallen from his horse. And this wasn't just about Penelope and her ledgers anymore. This was about my brother. That night, a writer came to the ranch. It was James Wilson. He owned the big operation 20 miles north, a man known for his sharp practices and cold ambition. He rode up like he owned the place, a smug smile on his face. "Jenkins," he said, dismounting. "Place is looking rustic." He glanced at Penelope, who stood silently in the doorway of the cabin, her face an emotionless mask. "I see you found yourself some help. Heard you got a bargain." "State your business, Wilson," I said, my hand resting near the revolver at my hip. "Always so direct," he chuckled. "I'm here to renew my offer. I want this land. It connects nicely to my southern pasture. I'll give you a fair price, enough to pack up your companion and start over somewhere else." His eyes lingered on Penelope, and there was a predatory gleam in them that made my blood boil. "The land's not for sale," I said. His smile vanished. "That's a foolish decision, Jenkins. This land has a way of swallowing up men who are all alone. Your brother found that out, didn't he? A tragic accident." The way he said it, the subtle emphasis on the word accident, it was a threat, a confession. He knew something about how Thomas died. "Think about my offer," Wilson said, climbing back onto his horse. "It's the only one you're going to get." As he rode away, Penelope stepped out beside me. "He's one of them," she said softly. "He works for Vance." It was all starting to make a horrible kind of sense. The new survey marker, Wilson's sudden interest in my worthless piece of rock and scrub, my brother's death. "It's not just the land," I said, thinking aloud. "It's something on the land. Thomas, he found something." That night, I tore my brother's room apart. I went through his meager belongings, his books, his old clothes. In the bottom of his trunk, tucked inside a worn copy of Moby Dick, I found it, a small leather-bound journal. His handwriting was frantic, looping. The last few entries were almost illegible. He wrote about Wilson, how Wilson had approached him as a partner. He wrote about the outcropping, about taking core samples. He wrote about assays and mineral rights. And then, the last entry dated the day before he died. "Wilson knows. He betrayed me. It's not silver. It's something else. Something they'll kill for." I sent the letter. Pray it gets there. Pray he understands. My breath caught in my throat. A letter. He sent me a letter. And I remembered. A strange, rambling letter that had arrived a week after his funeral. I'd thought it was just the incoherent ramblings of a man working himself to death. I hadn't understood. I raced to my own chest and dug it out from a stack of old papers. His words suddenly swam into focus. It was full of our childhood codes, phrases, and stories only we would understand. He wrote about our old dog, Blue, who was always digging for shiny rocks. He wrote about the time we saved 2 doves from a hawk and how the cost of 2 doves was a day's work. And then, the final line. "A package is coming from the east. She is the key. Pay the cost of 2 doves. Trust no one." The auction. The $2 silver. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't pity. My brother had sent for her. He had arranged for his ally to arrive. never knowing he'd be dead before she got there. I looked at Penelope, who was watching me with those intelligent, questioning eyes. You, I whispered, the journal and the letter trembling in my hands. You weren't running from your past. You were sent here to help me fight for my future. The revelation hung in the air between us, as heavy and real as the smell of pine and dust. Penelope wasn't an accident. She was a contingency. My brother's last desperate play from beyond the grave. She read the journal and the letter, her face grim. He must have used an agency, a contact that was supposed to be discreet, she said. Vance must have intercepted the communication. That's why his men were at the auction. They weren't just there to capture me. They were there to intercept my meeting with your brother. And they would have, I said, the pieces falling into place with sickening speed. If I hadn't shown up with $2 silver. The cost of 2 doves, she whispered, her eyes wide. It was a signal. For him. And for you. We were no longer 2 strangers. We were 2 halves of a plan we were just now beginning to understand. The weight of it was crushing, but for the first time since Thomas died, I didn't feel alone. I felt a flicker of hope, a dangerous, wild hope. But Wilson and Vance wouldn't just give up. They had killed my brother. They wouldn't hesitate to kill us. The sabotage started 2 days later. It was subtle at first. A section of the creek downstream from our water source was suddenly fouled, the water turning murky and slick with some kind of oil. The cattle wouldn't drink it. Then a small rock slide blocked the main trail to town. It was carefully placed, just big enough to be a major nuisance, to isolate us. Each incident was a message. We can get to you anytime we want. Give up. We worked in a state of constant vigilance, sleeping in shifts, never turning our backs on the vast, empty landscape that surrounded us. The romance that might have grown in the quiet spaces between 2 people sharing a home was replaced by the taut, unspoken bond of soldiers in a trench. I was coming to admire her in a way that scared me. Her resilience, her sharp mind, her surprising toughness. She never complained. She just adapted. One evening, we had an unexpected visitor. It was Sarah Miller, the doctor's wife from town. She was a kind, practical woman who had always been friendly to me. She brought a basket with a freshly baked loaf of bread and some preserves. I was just so worried, Porter, she said, her face a mask of concern. With all the trouble you've been having, the rock slide, it's just terrible. Penelope was polite but distant, watching Mrs. Miller with an unnerving stillness. Mrs. Miller insisted on making tea. As she bustled around our small kitchen, her back to us, I saw Penelope's eyes narrow. She watched the other woman's hands, her gaze fixed on the small vial Mrs. Miller palmed for a split second before adding something to the steaming teapot. It happened so fast I would have missed it if I wasn't looking. When Sarah Miller turned around smiling and offered Penelope a cup of tea, Penelope smiled right back. Thank you, Sarah, she said, her voice sweet as honey. But you know I have a terrible headache. Porter, would you be a dear and fetch me the willow bark from the pantry? The doctor said it would help. I was confused, but I did as she asked. When I returned, Penelope and Mrs. Miller had swapped cups. I believe you take yours with milk, don't you, Sarah? Penelope said, pushing the other cup toward her. I wouldn't want to get them mixed up. The color drained from Sarah Miller's face. She stared at the teacup in front of her as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. She stammered, making excuses about needing to get home before dark, and practically fled from the cabin, leaving the tea untouched. I stared at Penelope in the silent aftermath. Laudanum, she said quietly, picking up the cup meant for her and sniffing it. A heavy dose, enough to make me sleep for a day, enough time for her to search the cabin for the ledgers. The betrayal was a cold slap in the face. It wasn't just Wilson. The whole town was a spider web, and we were the flies caught in the middle. We couldn't trust anyone. She seems so kind, I said, feeling naive and foolish. Penelope looked at me, her expression hard. In my experience, she said, the most dangerous monsters are the ones who pretend to be your friend. The failed attempt on Penelope seemed to accelerate things. The enemy was getting impatient. We knew a direct assault had to be coming soon. We had the evidence. Thomas's journal and Vance's ledgers that could ruin them all, but it was useless if we were dead. We needed a way to get the information to someone in power. Someone beyond Wilson and Vance's reach. A territorial marshal, maybe. But the nearest office was in Helena, a 3-day ride away, and we knew we were being watched. Leaving the ranch would be suicide. We were trapped. A siege of 2 against an army we couldn't even see. The pressure was immense. In the quiet hours of the night, during our shared watches, the walls we had built around ourselves began to crumble. We talked. We shared stories of the lives we had before this madness. I told her about Thomas, about our dreams of building the ranch into something that would last. She told me about the little girl she had been a governess for, Arthur Vance's daughter, and how leaving the child behind was the hardest thing she'd ever done. For the first time, I saw the true cost of her fight. It wasn't just her own safety. It was the sacrifice of every normal piece of a life she might have had. One night, as a storm raged outside, shaking the very foundations of the cabin, the fear and exhaustion became too much. The line between us, the space kept clear by circumstance and danger, finally dissolved. I reached out and took her hand. It was cold, but she wrapped her fingers around mine, her grip surprisingly strong. We didn't say anything. We didn't have to. In that moment, holding her hand while the world tried to tear us apart, I knew I was falling in love with her. Not the idea of her, but the real, fierce, brilliant, and wounded woman sitting beside me. The next day, we came up with a desperate plan. There was one person in town I thought I could trust. Old Man Hemlock, a prospector who lived on the edge of town. He was a recluse, cantankerous and strange, but my brother had always said he was one of the few honest men left in the territory. Penelope spent the morning making copies of the most critical pages of the ledgers in Thomas's journal. We couldn't risk sending the originals. She stitched the copies into the lining of a saddlebag. The plan was for me to ride out at dawn, create a diversion to the south, drawing Wilson's watchers after me. While they were occupied, Penelope, dressed in my brother's old clothes, would take Maple, the faster horse, and ride north, circle around, and try to get to Hemlock's cabin unnoticed. It was a crazy risk. If they caught her, they wouldn't hesitate to kill her. "It's too dangerous," I said for the 10th time. "Let me go." "No," she said, her jaw set. "You're the better rider, the better fighter. They will expect you to be the one carrying the package. The diversion has to be believable. It has to be you. I'm smaller. I can ride low and use the terrain. This is the only way, Porter." She was right, and I hated it. As dawn broke, we stood by the horses. The air was cold and still. I looked at her, dressed as a boy, her face smudged with dirt for camouflage. My heart ached with a fear so profound it almost crippled me. "Penelope," I started, but I couldn't find the words. She stepped forward and pressed something small and cold into my hand. It was one of the 2 silver dollars. "For luck," she whispered. "Come back to me, Porter Jenkins." Before I could answer, she pulled my face down and kissed me. It wasn't a soft, tender kiss. It was hard and desperate, a kiss that tasted of fear and gunpowder and a future we might never have. Then she was gone, melting into the pre-dawn shadows. I mounted my horse, took a deep breath, and kicked him into a gallop, riding south and yelling at the top of my lungs, praying I was a good enough actor to buy her the time she needed, praying it wasn't the last time I would ever see her. The chase was relentless. 2 of Wilson's men materialized out of the landscape, just as we'd predicted. They were good, pushing me hard, trying to corner me in the rocky canyon south of the ranch. For hours I led them on a wild goose chase, my horse lathered in sweat, my lungs burning. I fired a few shots over their heads, just enough to keep them interested, to make them believe I was the one they wanted. All I could think about was Penelope. Was she safe? Did she make it? The uncertainty was a physical pain, a sharp knife twisting in my gut. By midday, I finally managed to lose them in a dense patch of forest and circled back toward the ranch, my horse exhausted. The journey home was the longest of my life. Every shadow looked like an ambush. When I saw the cabin, still standing, smoke curling from the chimney, a wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy washed over me. She was inside, pale and tired, but safe. "Did you make it?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She nodded. "Hemlock. He's an odd man. But you were right. He's honest. He looked at the pages, read them right there in front of me. He said he'd known something was rotten ever since Thomas died. She took a shaky breath. He's on his way to Helena. He left an hour after I did, on a mule packed for a month-long prospecting trip. No one will suspect. We had done it. The message was out. Now all we could do was wait and survive. But Wilson wasn't going to wait. He must have known something was up when his men returned empty-handed. He knew his time was running out. The attack came just after dusk. It wasn't a subtle act of sabotage this time. It was an all-out assault, at least a half dozen of them, emerging from the trees, rifles glinting in the twilight. They started firing at the cabin, splintering the wood, shattering the single window. We were ready. We doused the lantern and took up our positions, me by the door, Penelope by the side window. We had barricaded the entry with a heavy table, and I had enough ammunition to last a while. The next few hours were a nightmare of noise and chaos. The crack of rifles, the ping of bullets hitting the cast-iron stove, the smell of gunpowder filling the small space. They were trying to pin us down, to surround us. Through it all, Penelope was a rock. She loaded and fired with a steady hand, her movements economical and precise. She wasn't afraid, or if she was, she didn't show it. In the brief lulls, she would look at me, her eyes communicating everything we didn't have time to say. Then there was a new sound, the crackle of fire. "They're trying to burn us out," I yelled over the gunfire. "They've lit the barn." I looked out the window and saw the terrifying orange glow. The barn with the last of our winter hay was going up like a tinderbox. The fire would spread to the cabin next. We were being cooked alive. We had two choices: stay inside and burn, or make a run for it and get cut down in the open. "We have to go," Penelope said, her voice grim. "Through the back, toward the creek. We can use the ravine for cover." It was a slim chance, but it was the only one we had. I kicked open the back door, laying down covering fire as Penelope scrambled out. I followed, bullets kicking up dirt around our feet. We ran, bent low, toward the darkness of the ravine. A figure rose up in front of us, blocking our path. It was Wilson. He had a rifle leveled at my chest. "It's over, Jenkins," he snarled, a triumphant grin on his face. "You and the little whore. You should have taken my offer." Behind him, his men were closing in. We were caught. I raised my revolver, knowing it was hopeless. And then I heard another sound. Not a rifle. A sound like a dozen horses riding hard. Suddenly, the night erupted with new gunfire. But it wasn't aimed at us. Wilson's men cried out in surprise and pain. A line of riders crested the hill, their forms silhouetted against the burning barn. They were organized, professional. At their lead was a grizzled old man with a shotgun and a familiar, cantankerous look on his face. Old Man Hemlock. And behind him were four men wearing the badges of the U.S. Marshals. Wilson stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He turned his rifle toward Penelope, a last desperate act of vengeance. But I was faster. My revolver bucked in my hand, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. Wilson staggered back, a look of surprise on his face before collapsing to the ground. It was over. In the aftermath, as the marshals rounded up Wilson's surviving men, Hemlock explained how he'd ridden like the devil was on his heels, catching the marshals on their patrol route just a day out of Helena. The lead marshal took our statements and collected the evidence. Thomas's journal and Vance's original ledgers. "This is bigger than just a land dispute," he said, looking at the meticulous columns in Penelope's handwriting. "This goes all the way back to Boston. You two have done the whole country a service." As the sun rose, casting a pale, smoky light over the wreckage of our ranch, we stood together and watched them lead the prisoners away. My barn was a smoldering ruin. My cabin was riddled with bullet holes, but we were alive. We had won. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of the conspiracy was unraveled. Wilson's operation was dismantled. The corrupt town officials were arrested. And news eventually came from the east that Arthur Vance and his father had been indicted, their shipping empire crumbling under the weight of the evidence Penelope had risked everything to secure. The land was officially ours, the mineral rights secured in my name. Thomas's discovery would make us wealthy beyond our wildest dreams. But standing there amidst the ruins, none of that seemed to matter. We had something more valuable than gold. We had each other. We rebuilt, side by side. We built a new barn, stronger than the last. We repaired the cabin, patching the bullet holes, replacing the windows. And as we worked, a new, quieter kind of life took shape. The constant fear was replaced by a deep, abiding peace. One evening, as we sat on the porch of our repaired home, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, I took her hand. It didn't feel like the hand of a soldier anymore. It felt like the hand of my partner, my friend, the woman I loved. The marriage contract, I said softly. It was just business, an arrangement. She looked at me, a small smile playing on her lips. Mutually beneficial, she corrected. I was thinking, I said, my heart pounding, that maybe we could make it real. Not because of a contract or a dying man's plan or a shared danger, but because we choose it, because I choose you, Penelope. Tears welled in her eyes, those beautiful mountain lake eyes, but this time they were warm. I choose you too, Porter Jenkins. We were married a month later, not by a disinterested broker, but by a traveling preacher, with Old Man Hemlock as our witness. It wasn't a big celebration, but it was real. Years passed. The ranch thrived. The mine my brother discovered brought prosperity not just to us, but to the whole region, as a new honest town grew up around it. We had 2 children, a boy we named Thomas, and a girl with her mother's fierce, intelligent eyes. On our 10th anniversary, after the children were asleep, I gave Penelope a small velvet box. Inside was a gold locket. She opened it, and her breath caught. Inside, polished to a brilliant shine, were 2 silver dollars. I kept them, I said, a reminder that sometimes your entire future can be bought for the last $2 to your name. She closed her hand over the locket, her eyes shining with love. Best bargain I ever made, she whispered. The story of the mail-order bride no one wanted, and the broken-down rancher who bought her, became a local legend. But they never got it quite right. They didn't know the secrets, the danger, or the truth of how 2 lost souls, brought together by a dead man's hope, managed to face down an empire and build a life from the ashes. They didn't know that our love story wasn't a romance. It was a war, and we won. The world is full of unlikely heroes and hidden battles. If you believe that courage can be found in the most unexpected places, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what story we'll uncover next.